Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell. And if you've been listening for a while, you know that I am an avid reader. And I'm so excited about my guest today because she has written what has to be one of my very favorite books this year. And it's also, to me, one of the most important books. So stay tuned because we're going to get into the details of that. Her name is Jennifer McCullum. Jennifer, welcome to my show.
Thank you so much, Meredith. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I have been looking forward to this ever since your book came out, and I'm going to tell my listeners what your book is in just a moment, but let me introduce you to them more formally first. Jennifer is the CEO of Linkage, a SHRM company, where she oversees the strategic direction and global operations of this leadership development firm. Linkage's mission is to change the face of leadership. And over the past 35 years, the company has been dedicated to improving leadership effectiveness and equity in hundreds of organizations globally through their assessments, training, coaching, consulting, and conferences. Jennifer has 20 years of experience building and leading businesses in the leadership space. She's a highly sought-after consultant and speaker with deep expertise in inclusive leadership and advancing women leaders. And she's the author of this important and outstanding book called In Her Own Voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO, Overcoming Hurdles to Change the Face of Leadership. And I highly recommend this book for women and men alike because so much of what's in there, Jennifer, is applicable to both men and women, and they each have different roles to play in this process. So let's start out talking about why you wrote the book. What was the driving factor, and what are you hoping people will get from it?
You know, Meredith, I felt like Linkage had the next chapter of the story to tell. You so graciously introduced me as the CEO. And what I love about Linkage is we have been working in the women's leadership space for 25 years. And we've been tracking the trends and our data through assessments, our insight, and evolving our frameworks and products and services to reflect that. And what happened during COVID and the post-COVID period was so pivotal that it caused us to realize we needed to evolve our own thinking about how we engaged in not only developing women leaders to accelerate their advancement, but how we worked with organizations who saw it as a business and leadership imperative to support the rise of women leaders.
So what is it that you had as your intention for people to really take away and be able to use from this? And we'll get into some of the details that are in the book, but I just wanted to kind of paint the picture of what the takeaways are, the big takeaways.
So the book is aimed at any woman who aspires to advance in her career and any leader, executive, or organization who aspires to support her and ideally support large groups of women ascending the ranks. As you may know, it's actually been a significant challenge across centuries. But really, during the COVID and post-COVID times, there was this surge of awareness, this awareness of what is the reality of women in the workforce. And if you remember way back then in 2020, there was this mass exodus of women. Now, that didn't hold true. College-educated women never left the workforce. And those who did leave have come back, thankfully, because women in the workforce really dropped to the levels that they were in the 1980s. Now that they've come back, this awareness is what is it actually going to take to make sure they are engaged and developed and they stay with your organization, because we know all of the data around gender equity at all levels of leadership drives better business results. But companies are consistently struggling with achieving their own goals or the goals that are being pushed upon them by their customers or by their stakeholders, by their investors. And so it's not only the right thing to do, it's the best business thing to do. But women have been challenged for decades and centuries, and Linkage has been at the forefront of those challenges. So the purpose of the book was to tell the next chapter in the story. What are the hurdles? What is happening? Why are they unique to women? How can we help women overcome those hurdles? And how can we help organizations support them?
I love the fact that the front end of your book, the structure is such that you're describing kind of the landscape of what the situation was. But the rest of the book is very empowering to people because you talk about what those hurdles are and what they can actually do. So it's taking that personal responsibility. So I love that theme of, don't wait for somebody else to figure this out and do it. There are things you can do now. And I know that there are a number of there were the overarching hurdle plus 7 other ones, and we don't have time to go into all of them today, but let's start with the one that you feel is so important because you didn't just make these up. These are based on the research that you've done through the assessments Linkage has done over decades, right?
Yeah, and thank you for raising that. I mean, this is a data-driven roadmap to help women and organizations overcome the unique challenges that women face. Now, oftentimes I get this, well, wait a minute, isn't that inequitable or exclusive to men? And the truth is, what it takes to be an effective leader is the same across the spectrum of gender. And Linkage does that work in the world too. But this work specifically is uniquely to the additional challenges that women face. And it's really important for women and men to understand those. And so that is the kind of the foundation of this work. And to answer your question, yes, we've been tracking the data through 360 assessments and through the perception study of women in hundreds and hundreds of companies. I mean, these are tens of thousands of data points that we have. And so we see what's rising in our data as some new and concerning trends, and we wanted to make sure we address those. But to your other point, it's important to understand the external reality. It's important to understand the external bias that has led us to this point. But this is not about blaming and it's not about shaming. It's about what can we do as women leaders to overcome the hurdles, and what can we do to support men and women executives and organizations to walk alongside the women in their path. So we can go deeper into the hurdles now if you'd like, but I really appreciate that foundation setting.
Yes. Well, in fact, what I would love for you to do, because you use a phrase that I don't think we think of often, those external biases, we're all familiar, I think, with those, but you also talk about internal bias. So please share that, because I think that's a big hurdle that some of us may not even be aware of. I know that I learned some important insights about myself as I went through that particular chapter.
I love that you have read the book so deeply, Meredith. Thank you. The internal bias is actually very real. And this is, based on what we have experienced. It could be in our childhood. It could be looking up and not seeing anyone that looks like us, whether it's in community leadership and spiritual leadership or in corporate and organizational leadership. What we have been exposed to in our childhood leads to the beliefs that we hold about ourselves. And so I'll use some very personal ones for me that I talk about in the book. Some of the internal biases that I held, even as I considered the CEO job, and I was going to be the first female CEO of this private equity-backed company called Linkage. And as I explored that opportunity, my inner critic shot up. We can talk about that next. But I had to get in touch with my internal biases. And they sounded like this once I got really clear about what they were. I have to be properly groomed to be a CEO. And even more so, I need to have CEO experience before I can be a CEO, which is a little crazy, right? Or I can't be the kind of mother I want to be with a big job. Or this is my favorite one. things are just done better when I do it all myself. Now, that's a belief a lot of women hold, and that went way back into my childhood where I was a doer and an achiever. So the thing about these internal biases, they may be informed by external bias, but when you hold them internally, they can really paralyze you and prevent you from achieving your dreams. And I had to hold, we'll just take one of them about being a mom. I had to hold that up and say, is this really true? I've had other big jobs, general management jobs in publicly traded companies running business units. Was I the type of mom I wanted to be there? And the answer is most of the time, right? Not all of the time, but most of the time. And so why was it different in this job? And I actually had to engage my family in a conversation before taking the job to say, this is something that I'm concerned about. I want to hold this belief up. Hey, kids, you're, at the age where one was in 5th grade and one was in 8th grade and one was in 9th grade. You're at the age where we can have these conversations. What do you think? And it was through that dialogue that I realized I was holding that belief, but it wasn't serving me.
Mm-hmm. It's why I loved that chapter so much, because all of us have these stories we tell ourselves that we believe because we've absorbed them or repeated them in our heads so much that it can limit us. I've always heard them, talk about limiting beliefs, but this internal bias for me just had a special twist or meaning to it that helped me realize I'm having a bias against myself. And so if I want to be my own best advocate, I need to break down these unconscious internal biases
Well, I'm
too.
glad. I mean, there's so much out there about the external bias, right? And I think it's easy to point to something outside of yourself and blame, kind of create a victim mentality. The power of the work that we do at Linkage, and I hope the power of the book, is to say, yes, it is so, and it exists, and we're working on that external bias, and it's going to take a long, long time. But if you really want to make change in your life, focus on what you can uniquely control, and that's your internal bias and your inner critic, and all of the hurdles are actually very scalable when you understand how to unlock. And to kind of to just to use the hurdle analogy, just to lower those hurdles so you can scale them even easier.
Yes, that's so great. Well, the inner critic is related, but not exactly the same as the internal bias. And it actually, you call it the overarching hurdle because it really does impact all the others. So talk a little bit about the inner critic piece.
So this is the really big one, and we call it the Uber hurdle because it weaves its way through all the other ones, and it can amplify them, and it can exacerbate the paralysis of just not taking action at all, which is one of the biggest challenges women face. So I'll use a very personal example, and the inner critic, just to define it, is that voice in our head. It's a voice of judgment. We call it the inner critic because it's usually pointed either at ourselves. And as we rise in our career, it tends to be pointed at ourselves, and it sounds like, I'm not worth it. I'm not ready. I shouldn't ask for, insert, raise, promotion, flexibility, resources. I shouldn't ask that question. But it also could be pointed at others. And when the inner critic is pointed at others, it could sound like, why doesn't he know that? She should have done something different. And so it's either judging yourself or judging others. And the truth is that voice in our head is usually speaking to us, if we're aware, almost all day long. And the challenge is, can I get close enough to that voice that I recognize it? Can I hold it out separately and notice and pause? Can I reflect on, is that voice serving me or not? Usually not, if it's the critic. And then what can I do to have a lot more compassion, either for myself or others, and to be a lot more curious? So just to get super specific, because I like to use examples.
Yeah.
The inner critic, for me, it usually spikes when I'm not comfortable, not confident, when I'm afraid. So when I think about being a first-time CEO, that inner critic spiked very loudly. And it sounded like, you're not ready. You won't get the job anyway. You haven't run the P&L effectively all the way down to the EBITDA or the net income line. But it also spiked again just about 6 months ago as we were bringing this book to market, and I was a first-time author. So it's a very vulnerable thing to write a book. And I found my inner critic saying things like, you're not a real author. You're going to be found out. What kind of person promotes her book to her friends and asks them to buy things? So there was a lot of chatter in my head. And that inner critic almost paralyzed me from taking the interview from the headhunter to move into the best job I've ever had. So let me just pause there and see if that resonates with you.
Well, it does. And one of the things that I liked that you gave as a framework was that compassion center. And you've just mentioned those, but I would love for you to, repeat them, because it's a way of not trying to get the inner critic to shut up, and try to force it, but to move along a different path where you acknowledge it and then move to these other areas that you talked about. So just go a little bit deeper with those, because I loved that phrase, compassion center. It immediately, conjured up in my mind a calming effect, and a quiet place. So the judgment is gone. It's that release of judgment, I think.
Oh, that's perfect. And that word judging is really, if you can get in touch with it. And the difficult thing about the inner critic, honestly, is that sometimes we are so deep into it, and we call it either we're one down, where we are judging ourselves and we need to move up to compassionate center, or conversely, if we're judging others, and you think about kind of the on top of the mountain looking down and judging everyone else, we're one up and we need to move down to compassionate center. And it's important either way. If we're judging others, we use this phrase a lot in our leadership work. What you think and feel drives what you say and do. So as much as we believe that our inner critic is inside of us and nobody else can see it, oftentimes it's leaking out and people can see whether you're one up or one down. So becoming aware of it is actually the most important first step. And sometimes you can't do it by yourself. I mean, for me, in the story about the inner critic, before I was even willing to be interviewed for the job, it took other people making me aware that my inner critic was causing me to withhold myself from my dream. And so these were two peers saying, well, wait a minute. I hear you saying you're not ready. And I was actually saying, I'm not ready. I need to be groomed. I'm not sure I can do this. But we think we're ready, and you were peers of ours, so we think you're ready. Why don't you think you're ready? And that kind of woke me up a little bit. So sometimes you can get in touch with it yourself. I've gotten better at that over the years, and sometimes it takes others. The second piece then is just the pause, because help you reflect what's actually going on here. And then the compassion piece, which you say, compassion piece, inviting that in, whether it's compassion for others, if you are one up, or compassion for yourself, if you're one down. If I got to the core of it, it was that I was afraid. Even though I'd managed big businesses and publicly traded companies, this was so different in kind in my mind that I wasn't sure I could be successful. So that was that compassion. And once I could acknowledge that, then I could become more curious. Well, let's get underneath that. If I haven't managed the OpEx before, maybe there's a fabulous COO that I could hire or exist that could help me through the pieces where I haven't had the direct experience. And that is, in fact, what happened.
That curiosity piece has served me so well as I've learned about this, because one of the things I have found, Jennifer, is if I'm finding myself feeling intolerant towards somebody, I've learned to pause and look at what's going on with me, because it's inevitably something about myself that's irritating me that then I'm sensing, that's triggering me about another person. So it's just recognizing it isn't them, it's my thoughts about what's going on.
Well, and I love that you use the word intolerance. And one of the things we teach is, what are your triggers? So when I'm one up, I'm usually very impatient. I start to interrupt people. And I actually laugh with my executive assistant about this because, when I'm not a very good administrative person. I deplore expense reports and so after a while I get a little bit impatient. And when I find myself getting a little snippy or cutting her off, I go, okay, Kelly, let me just take a deep breath here. That it's been half an hour and I can't really tolerate too much admin, all at once. So I'm going to remove myself and we'll try again tomorrow. But now I'm aware of the triggers, right? When I'm one up or when I'm one down, if I'm beating myself up and saying like, see, I told you you weren't a real author and, what kind of person are you? And I'm feeling dejected, I'm feeling small. In the case of the story I told you about the kind of imposter syndrome around being an author, I literally had to stop and pick up the book and hold it with my name on it to say, like, I am a real author. And so that, once you get used to the triggers, they almost become your friends because you can become aware much more naturally.
Mm-hmm. Was in your case, I was just thinking, you have the evidence right there. And sometimes we don't acknowledge the evidence that's there. We can just see the negatives and focus on that. So I just love that whole compassion center concept. I think it's brilliant, and I think it's practical. It can really help us.
And I'm
glad
you mentioned evidence because at some point I want to talk about what we call recognized confidence. And that is
yes, I had that. We can go there right now.
Okay,
We don't have to go in any particular order because I kind of did a double take because I'm used to thinking about confidence, but recognized confidence was a new concept. And I thought it's again, so on target. So yes, tell us about what you mean by that and why it matters and how it's a hurdle for people.
And recognized confidence is one of the two that we've really significantly shifted our perspective on since the post-COVID era. And if we think back to, even 5 years ago, but probably more 10 to 20, when the women's leadership development, industry started to bubble up, it was really focused on, if we could just help women become more confident, if we could somehow beat the imposter syndrome out of them. And so there was all kinds of focus on helping with confidence. But the truth is, that is very, very difficult to do. It's kind of like beating out your internal or the biases that we have. And so what we talk about now is how do we ensure that we shine a light, and this was the evidence word that caused me to think about this, shine a light on your excellence. And women need to do a much better job of providing evidence of that excellence because most of us feel like we are competent. It's how do we ensure that others see us in our competence and shine a light on our excellence? And sometimes we're ready to do that. And I gave a keynote yesterday, actually, where I made the comment about, I made some kind of comment of, I've gotten really comfortable being on stages and presenting, and I love it. And I found that I'm actually really good at it. And so just claiming some of your strengths. But sometimes women are not ready to do that. They either feel like it's disingenuous or they feel like it's boastful. And that's certainly an external bias that we've grown up with. Don't brag or don't be too loud. So if we're not ready to do that, how do we ensure that we surround ourselves with supporters and allies who help shine a light on our excellence for us? And then we can suspend our disbelief about our abilities until we catch up with the people who already believe in us. And that was like the example I shared with the two men in my life who said, you are ready to be a CEO and we believe it. And we're going to hold on until you believe it.
Love for you to share an example of where you have made a conscious effort to notice with your own staff and you recognize, so you're feeding their own confidence.
And women don't tend to have a problem with feeding confidence to others. It's actually the reverse. So, and again, we've been conditioned to shine a light on others. And so mostly when I acknowledge, and, Catherine, the Women in Leadership Institute that you led was such a success this year by all measures. The first response from Catherine, and it just happened a week or two ago, was, oh, it wasn't me. It was the team around me. And there is nothing wrong with humility, and there's nothing wrong with shining a light on the team. But I want to encourage women, especially, to claim the role that they played in it. It's important. And so that's one thing I say, like, Catherine, I actually want you to pause and I want you to play back to me, thank you. And what I'm especially proud of is X. So that's one thing. Secondly, I often tell the story, or many stories, about what good allyship looks like. And so again, if a woman isn't ready, or a man for that matter, isn't ready to have the light shined or shone upon them, then could we reinforce or even ask others to help? And so I often tell the story of when I was a new executive on the SHRM executive team after we got acquired. One of my peers, the chief knowledge officer at SHRM named Alex, was very pointed, not once, but a couple times across the course of several months in the executive team meetings, of acknowledging the critical question I had asked or the critical idea that I had offered. And he was able to shine a light on me when I was less confident and comfortable as a newer member of the executive team.
Mm-hmm. It's just raising our own awareness to opportunities to do that with other people. Because I think our own example of being specific is so important too, so that it's not just this broad brushstroke of you're great, and I love that you turned it around to your team member to ask her what specifically she was most proud of, because it forces her to think, what was it I did that contributed to this being such a success?
And honestly, this is where the recognized confidence, and I love the hurdles, we actually deliver them in order because one builds and feeds on another. And so recognized confidence follows brand and presence, because you want to make sure that you are shining a light either on yourself or others are shining a light on you for how you want to be known. Right. And so my colleague, Kristen Howe, who's our chief product officer, came to me earlier in the year as we were setting our goals for the year and the personal development goals. And she said, look, Jennifer, I've been watching you on stages these last few years, and you've been really honing your skills. I want to be a better keynote speaker. And so we had a plan, and we have a speech coach, and we aligned some hours for the speech coach. And I said, I'm going to look for more opportunities for you to get on stages. And luckily, we were on stages all over the country, and I was on all over the world this year with the SHRM acquisition. And she had a keynote speech in Ohio. It was at a state conference. And I mean, it was a big one. There were several hundred people there. And she texted me from the conference and said, I crushed it. I loved it. The organizers told me it was one of the best keynotes of the entire conference. The scores are coming in. And she did it so beautifully and so appropriately. And with Kristen, I will expect about once a week. It'll be a text, it'll be an email, it'll be a phone call where she is telling me. Sometimes it's how she overcame a challenge. Sometimes it's just where she did a really good job. But it's always aligned to her very specific professional goals in terms of how she wants to be seen and the clarity that she has around the future direction of her career. So she's not bragging about how well she took notes in a meeting. She's bragging about, and I say bragging, she's appropriately shining a light on herself aligned to the excellence she wants to be known for.
Mm-hmm. I think that's so important. And it ties in with one of the other topics I wanted to have us talk about, the clarity, because they are so intricately related. And I think clarity about how you want to be perceived and then be recognized for, it goes back to that earlier step or earlier hurdle on clarity, because a lot of people lack that understanding of who they really could be, want to be, and want to be known for. So talk a little bit about what that is. Why do people struggle with that, and how can they gain better clarity?
Yeah, and I want to tease apart because these are all very nuanced, but you're right, they all link together. So brand and presence is how you want to be seen. When people describe you, how do they, what are the words that they use? And most people actually don't think about that, you know. And so I'm very intentional about how I want to be seen, you know, as a visionary, but also a strategist, as someone who can rally a team aligned to an aspirational goal. So I don't want to be seen as a detailed oriented, you know, executor, even though those are really important skills. They're not the ones I want to be seen for, nor they're the ones that are my strengths. Clarity is, what does success look like for you? In this case, it's in your professional life, but it can be in any aspect of your life. In fact, the work in the book is actually pretty comprehensive about any aspect of your life. But for the work we do, it's primarily professional. So when I asked women, and I do this daily, when I ask them, what does success look like for you at a point in the future? And it's usually 2+ years out. And the reason is it can't feel so close to current reality that it doesn't feel like a stretch. And most of the time, women will say, I don't know. Like, nobody's ever asked me that before. Or I don't possibly have time to think about that. I'm too busy. And my least favorite is, I'm afraid to claim what I want in terms of success in my professional life, even verbally, because if I don't get it, it feels worse than not saying anything at all. And so my coaching to women is, actually, it is better to say it, even if you don't get it, because by putting it out there, it helps all of us know exactly how to help you. The network you need access to, the support that we can offer, the development we can give you. If you don't know what you want, I don't know how to help you. And so clarity becomes one of the very first hurdles for women, because they define success in the context of their team, the context of their family, the context of their organization, but rarely, very rarely, in the very selfish context of, what do you want? And I don't think that's selfish at all, by the way.
Well, no, I just think it's such a fundamental element of everything that goes into achieving who you can be as a person. I think clarity about yourself, we get clarity around goals and other aspects, say, of our jobs, but clarity about who we are, what we want. I love that you have that. And you did give a number of different examples in terms of the key words, in terms of the vision you want to be, as well as then how that relates to the branding and what you want to be known for and as, because I just think that taking the time to pause and say, I'm worth the time to think about this. It goes back to that inner critic too. What do you, questioning whatever it is somebody might dream they want to be or do, and afraid because it might, like you just said so well, afraid to articulate it because it might not happen. Yet I'm with you. I think the more you can be clear and state it to others, here's who I am, here's where I'm going, the better they can be of service to you.
That's exactly right. And that's why I don't think it's selfish at all. It's just like so many women want to help other people, and this kind of gets to the networking hurdle. Women are fantastic at curating a network, and they're fantastic at giving to the network. But when it comes to activating the network and making very specific asks, women are very willing to do for others. But when it comes to asking from the network, somehow the inner critic spikes, and it sounds like this. Well, I couldn't possibly ask, in my case, one of my mentors is Alan Mulally, who's the fabulous former CEO of Boeing and Ford. I couldn't possibly ask Alan to spend time with me. And yet, when the tables are turned and anyone asks for 30 minutes to help me achieve their aspirations and dreams, you look, if it's couched appropriately, and if it's a genuine ask, and if it's done in the right way, the answer is always yes. So why are we willing to give but not believe that others will give to us?
Oh, there's all kinds of things that can run through our minds with that. But I loved your story about how you did approach Alan Mulally and ask him to help you. And I would love for you to share that, because I think that would be inspiring to my listeners. I would like each listener to think about who is somebody that you would like to have a relationship with or know or approach, and listen to Jennifer's example, because to me, it just shows, why not ask? Why not? Good things can come from it. So please share that.
So this is one of my favorite stories, and it actually combines the hurdles of making the ask with networking. So again, going all the way back to clarity and back to 2020, picture where you were in January of 2020 when we were all still, denying the fact that there was this little problem going on over in China. So I was at the Marshall Goldsmith 100 Coaches community. It's a very special network that I am privileged to be a part of. And it was MLK weekend, and I was 18 months into my CEO tenure. And things were going well, but I felt like they could be going better. I'd done a lot of things. I'd put a vision and a strategy in place. I'd surrounded myself with a good executive team. I had board governance. I had leadership practices and principles, but things weren't all clicking along exactly as I would like, but I wasn't sure why. So fast forward, and I'm watching Alan and Marshall Goldsmith, whom you may know is probably the most famous CEO coach in the entire world. And I was watching them hold court for an entire day. Marshall was Alan's coach at, certainly at Ford. He might have been at Boeing as well. And Alan was talking through how he led Boeing and Ford separately through two massive crises, the 9/11, two Boeing aircraft went through the tower, and the World Trade Center, and then Ford during the Great Recession. And I was transfixed. I mean, Meredith, all I could think about was, I need Alan to help me. He was introducing this thing called the BPR, the Business Plan Review, and it almost unlocked for me this missing link that would bring everything together that I had been trying to do at Linkage. And so I went up to Marshall after this day. It was so inspiring. And Marshall's a friend and he's a mentor and a coach. And I said, Marshall, do you ever think that Alan would talk to me about how, as a CEO, he deployed the BPR in these companies? And honestly, between us, I was kind of hoping that Marshall would just kind of broker the relationship and would make it easy for me to meet Alan. But instead, he said, I don't know. Why don't you ask him? So that was not great, because here I am in San Diego. Alan's leaving the next morning, and I'm kind of racking my brain with how to do this. So I wake up, it's 5:00 in the morning, I'm on East Coast time, and I go to the gym. And I show up at the Hyatt Regency, 17th floor, breakfast club room, and where the continental breakfast is. And I kind of barge in, and I'm all sweaty, and I grab a banana, and I've got my phone and my iPad, and I look up, and Alan is standing at the toaster by himself. So my inner critic shoots straight up. Like, you aren't ready to have this conversation. You haven't thought about your talking points. You're all sweaty in your gym clothes. You have no makeup on. You don't look good, and blah, blah, blah. And then something inside of me just said, if not now, when? When will I ever have an opportunity? I mean, this guy is on the board of Google and Mayo Clinic, and he is being asked for help all the time. So I mustered up the courage to make the ask. And the ask was for a conversation. Alan, I am going to institute your business plan review at Linkage. Gave him a sentence about Linkage. And I'm going to do it based on everything that I'm reading and everything that I heard yesterday. But there were a few things that you said about how you were as the CEO and how you operated in those meetings that I felt were so critical that I would love to talk to you about how you did it before I instituted at Linkage, because I don't want to mess it up. It was something like that benign. It was kind of 60 seconds. And he was so sweet. And he said, why don't you send me an email? And I thought, that's it. He's never going to respond. But I'm telling you, Meredith, that started a 4-year mentorship of one of the most special relationships I've ever had. And Alan and I now text. There's emails that he permitted me to use in the book. And so that's kind of bringing Alan into my network and making a very specific ask of that network. I think it's a perfect story.
Well, it is. I just loved reading that, and hearing you tell it and bringing it to life is even better. Because I just think too many times we get that inner critic running through our heads with the same kinds of things. So this person wouldn't want to hear from me, or why would they give me the time of day? When in fact, what do we have to lose? In fact, one of the things I always tell myself, if I don't ask, the answer's already no. So if I hear no again, it doesn't matter.
Well, making the ask is the third highest hurdle for women after proving your value, which we haven't talked about yet, clarity, and then making the ask. And I do find that women tend to really water down their asks. And it's because of that inner critic. I don't deserve that, or it's not going to play well with that person, so I probably shouldn't. And so I have several stories in the book of kind of different periods of my career from my 20s well into my CEO-ship, where you get better and better at making the ask when you make the ask. And so it's
Mhm.
almost building that muscle. Look, it's important to have the data to test it out with your advisors to make sure that the ask is in line with what the market or the stakeholders would expect. You don't want to way overshoot, but that's not the problem with women. Women way undershoot. And frankly, that's what's driven the pay inequity in our country across, multiple generations.
Mhm. Yeah, it goes back to so many external factors that can influence. Well, thinking about the what is it, proving your value? Is that it? Yeah. We'll go there for just a moment because I want to also ask you about one other thing related to men. So just talk a little bit about what's the issue? What's the hurdle around proving your value?
Proving your value is the number one hurdle. And we also call it over rowing the boat. And it's this tendency for women to put their head down and work harder and harder and harder and take on more and more and say yes to more and more things. Because frankly, we condition women to say yes for everything, which I also think is a little bit of a mistake. You say yes to the things that align with your clarity and align with your brand on how you want to be known. And we offer in the book, how do you actually distinguish between what you need to do yourself and what can you inspire others to do? What can you delegate? And sometimes those things are done better when you delegate. And then we
Mhm.
also talk about the perfectionist trap, that inner critic and that inner critic that surfaced into the internal bias that I mentioned. If things are going to get done right, I have to do them myself. And a lot of women hold that. And that might be true. But the downside of doing everything yourself is really serious, not only because it leads to burnout, but it also prevents others from stepping into their excellence and their contribution. And so women need to understand there is a double-sided downfall of trying to do it all ourselves and our belief that it's just going to be all better, either at home. Women, like, remember, like, your partners are there and they are very capable people of trying to do it all.
Mhm. It's we can't go into depth with everything. You've covered so much. I do want to talk about the role of men because many men are in situations or positions where they could have an impact with the women who are around them. So, what do you recommend that men do to be allies? In fact, there's a number of different things you talk about: allies, mentors, and then executive sponsorship. So, I want to make sure that we address that. So, you can do that in the context of what men can do, but of course, women can also be involved with executive sponsorship.
For sure. And one of the challenges with what I call in the book the third shift, I didn't coin that term, but the term surfaced during the pandemic, was because women, the first shift being their day job, the second being their home care, child care, elder care, which is 3 hours more a day than men, which was the spike during the pandemic. And then the third shift is that office care. And the office care incorporates things like the women spending a disproportionate amount of time versus men on things like helping their staff with burnout or work-life prioritization, or things like DEI and executive sponsorship. I'm always really careful when we go into organizations and work on things like executive sponsorship of over depending on the women or other underrepresented populations to take the lioness's share of that work. And I also want to, anyone who identifies as a man on this call, I want to congratulate you, because we need you. And I want you to see the critical role that you play, because you are 72% of the leadership majority at the VP level and above in the United States. We can't solve the problem of accelerating gender equity without you. So how do you do it? And I like that you actually framed it the way we frame in the book. There's allyship, there's coaches, there's mentorship, there's sponsorship, and we actually tease them apart very intentionally. Anybody can be an ally. So Alex, the chief knowledge officer in my story of shining a light on me, was an ally, right? If we notice opportunity or inequity, we need to call it out appropriately. Whether it's one-on-one or if if it's a safe group to have those conversations, notice what is happening and just talk about it. And when I say that, I mean things like, gosh, isn't it interesting how we've asked the women to take the notes? Or, you know what, I'm going to volunteer to do the report out because I really want Jennifer to pay full attention. So things like that is what an ally can do, or what an ally can do. On the other spectrum, I want to talk about executive sponsorship, because executive sponsors are uniquely people, men and women, they tend to be more men based on the data I shared, who are in positions of power and influence and have political capital. And they can point that political capital at opening doors and ensuring that women and other underrepresentation comes through those doors and surrounds them with the support to ensure that they succeed. Now, you have to earn a sponsor. A sponsor has to be someone who knows you, knows your work, and is willing to put their reputation on the line. The trick is many executives, men and women, don't really know how to be a good sponsor. And so we introduce that in the book, but we have full programs at Linkage teaching executives what excellent sponsorship looks like.
Mm. And I loved the example you gave. I think it was an auto parts store. You didn't name them, but they actually matched up. I think it was they were mostly white males with women of color, which gave them both just a tremendous experience in learning more about someone who's different from them.
No, that's exactly right. And look, in the book, we name almost every company in person, but there's a big approval process. So if we didn't get the approval, we didn't put them in the book. I loved that company example because they very specifically said, our leadership does not reflect our customer base. And very specifically, we need to ensure we have more women, and specifically women of color, in our leadership ranks. And so we at Linkage came in and worked with the women themselves, helping them overcome the hurdles through development and coaching and assessment. But equally, we worked with the mostly men who were identified as sponsors. It was the CEO -2. So his executive team and the leadership team underneath. And they were matched 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 sponsors to, I think they called them proteges. And what happened over time, look, executives don't want to be trained. So we had really important, sponsorship conversations, multiple over the course of time, about what does it look like and what's hard about it and what is your experience, and then supporting each other and then bringing sponsors and proteges together. So it was a very interesting, and what would happen over time is the sponsors would say, I think I'm learning more than my protege, and how to engage in conversation and connect with people who don't look like me. The perspectives and the skills that they're bringing that I wasn't really aware of, the pipeline that we're building now that I see I have an open position. Those were the kind of things we unlocked through programs like that.
Mm-hmm. It's so powerful because it just is such a demonstration of how things can be changed. You're not going to wave a magic wand and all of a sudden, poof, everybody appreciates those differences or understands them. But creating a structure and an environment where people have the opportunity to really learn and then make changes and have these ahas based on those experiences. I just love that. So in wrapping up, we've covered so much, but what else would you like to share with my audience that we haven't talked about yet that you feel like is a really important point you'd like to make?
Whether you're a woman leader who still has a lot of aspiration, but aren't sure where to turn, I want you to start. You can start with the book. Ideally, you would read the book with a group of people, either at your organization or a group of people that you respect and admire, and you want to help each other. So doing these things, this evolution in groups is actually far more powerful than trying to do it on your own. And if you're an organization who sees the potential and is maybe struggling with attracting or retaining or engaging women leaders, I want you to start too. And it could be as simple as picking up the book and seeing how other companies are doing it, or it can be maybe understanding your data a little bit better by doing an organizational assessment. It takes 6 or 8 minutes. But by starting, you can then create goals, you can create a strategy, and our very best clients are the ones who have committed to this journey, to supporting their women leaders, to supporting the creation of an organizational culture where everyone feels like they belong, where they can uniquely contribute. And that's really what it's going to take to accelerate the advancement of women and other underrepresented populations.
Great summary statement. I want to encourage every one of my listeners to get the book In Her Voice. You will love it. Jennifer, I thought one of the things I love so much about the book is your own vulnerability and openness. Your stories just brought every point, that you were making, all the hurdles, because you experienced them all and you share them so openly, along with what you learned from that and what you learned to do, and giving very specific strategies. So this is one of those books that to me is a wonderful reference to have a sort of a handbook. And men, you can identify with so many of these same hurdles, I'm sure, and also learn how you can best support the women that are in your life at home as well as at work. So Jennifer, let people know how they can connect with you and get a copy of the book and learn more about the great work that you all are doing there at Linkage.
Perfect. Well, we'll start with the book. That's the easy part. You can go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, a lot of airports, your favorite local bookstore. It's In Her Own Voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO by Jennifer McCollum. If you want to reach out to me personally, I love LinkedIn, and I'm a very good LinkedIn messenger. So connect with me, and then once we're connected, we can message back and forth. I love hearing your stories, men and women, about what they're challenged by, where their successes are. So that's great. And then finally, if you want to know a little bit more about the work we do at Linkage, go to shrm.org, shrm.org/In Her Own Voice.
Great. Jennifer, I want to acknowledge you. You, to me, are such a special human being with who you have become and, your own evolution, which I told you when we first started today. I feel like I know you, that you're a friend, just because of how well I got to know you through your stories in your book. And the work that you're doing, to me, is extraordinary. And I want to thank you for stepping up and overcoming the hurdles that you have to shine such a bright light on what's possible for other women. So thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Meredith. It's such an honor and a privilege.
Thanks for tuning into my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out our 2 books, Connect with Your Team and Peer Coaching Made Simple. While you're there, download the free facilitator guide to find out how to implement our unique peer coaching system. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.